Governments have always claimed that inflation is an unfortunate side effect of growth, a necessary evil, something abstract, technical, unavoidable. When a government spends more than it collects in taxes, it faces a choice. It can raise taxes openly and risk public backlash, or it can quietly reduce the value of the money itself. Inflation is not an accident. It is a policy tool. Instead of taking money directly from citizens, the state allows prices to rise faster than wages. Every dollar in your pocket buys less than it did before, without a single new tax law being passed. The loss is real, but invisible. This strategy is far older than modern economics. On the surface, nothing changed. The coins looked the same. They carried the same official value. But in reality, the people holding them paid the price. Savings evaporated. Prices rose. Wages lagged behind. What Rome had created was an invisible tax on the entire population, one that disproportionately hurt those with no assets and no political power. Today, the mechanics are more sophisticated, but the logic is identical. Central banks expand the money supply. Governments finance deficits through monetary policy rather than direct taxation. The result is the same slow transfer of purchasing power away from households and toward debtors, asset holders, and the financial system. Inflation does not announce itself as theft. It disguises itself as normal. And that is precisely why it works. In medieval Europe, kings did not pretend that borrowing was voluntary. Merchants and wealthy guilds were routinely asked to lend money to the crown. Refusal often meant confiscation, punishment, or worse. These loans were framed as patriotic duties, but repayment was uncertain at best. Sometimes the debt was honored. Often it was delayed. Frequently, it was repaid in debased currency. The result was predictable. Wealth flowed upward, while risk and loss remained with those who had little power to resist. Modern governments no longer rely on coercion so openly. Instead, they have perfected a cleaner system: public debt. Today, governments issue bonds. Wealthy individuals, banks, pension funds, and corporations buy them. The state promises safety and interest. On paper, it looks fair. But ask a deeper question. Who ultimately pays for those interest payments? The answer is not the bondholders. It is the public. Taxes on consumption, fees, inflation, reduced public services. These are the mechanisms through which the debt is serviced. The wealthy receive predictable returns. Ordinary citizens pay the bill through daily life. This is not a coincidence. It is the structure. Public debt allows governments to borrow from the top of society while collecting repayment from the bottom. It transforms political spending into a long-term claim on future labor and consumption. A quiet transfer, legal, normalized, and repeated across centuries under different names. Public debt is almost always justified with noble intentions: infrastructure, economic growth, jobs, stability. Citizens are told that borrowing today will create prosperity tomorrow. And in some cases, limited deficit spending does support real development. But history shows that this is rarely where most of the money goes. In practice, a significant portion of government spending flows toward defense contracts, politically connected corporations, and large institutions deemed too important to fail. These expenditures are concentrated, while the costs are diffuse. When the time comes to pay the bill, governments almost never reduce spending at the top. They do not cut military budgets first. They do not eliminate corporate subsidies. They do not reduce financial sector privileges. Instead, they turn to the familiar tools: higher taxes, inflation, and reduced social benefits. The burden is framed as a collective sacrifice, but the sacrifice is never evenly shared. Deficit spending allows benefits to be delivered immediately to powerful groups, while the consequences are delayed and distributed across millions of people who had no direct say in the decision. By the time the cost becomes visible, the policymakers have moved on, and the beneficiaries are already secure. Debt creates distance. Distance creates deniability, and deniability makes the system politically sustainable. Few events expose this structure more clearly than financial crises. In 2008, banks engaged in reckless speculation, packaging risky mortgages into complex financial products and selling them as safe investments. When the system began to collapse under its own weight, the consequences threatened the global economy. Governments responded quickly, not by allowing failure, but by providing massive bailouts. Public funds were injected into private institutions under the argument that the system had to be saved. Citizens were told that these actions were necessary to prevent total collapse. And in the short term, the collapse was avoided. But the deeper outcome was rarely discussed. The banks survived. Many grew larger. Market concentration increased. Risk-taking resumed. Meanwhile, households lost homes, jobs, and savings. A generation entered the workforce under weaker conditions, higher debt, and reduced opportunity. The logic was simple. Profits belonged to private institutions during good times. Losses were transferred to society during bad times. This pattern is not an exception, it is a rule. Bailouts are presented as emergency measures, but they reinforce a system where failure is absorbed by the public while success remains privately owned. Over time, this dynamic encourages even greater risk, knowing that the downside will not be fully borne by those who cause it. Stability is preserved, but at a price quietly paid by everyone else. Most people believe their pension contributions are being saved for them. They imagine a pool of money set aside, growing safely over decades, waiting for retirement. This belief is understandable and largely incorrect. In many countries, public pension systems operate on a pay-as-you-go model. The money collected today is not invested for the future. It is spent almost immediately to pay current retirees. What remains are promises. IOU as backed by future taxpayers. This system functions smoothly only as long as there are enough working-age contributors to support those who have retired. When demographics shift, fewer workers, more retirees, the math begins to break down. At that point, governments do not admit structural failure. They announce reforms. Retirement ages are raised. Benefits are reduced. Payments are eroded through inflation. The burden is shifted forward in time, from one generation to the next. Younger workers are told that sacrifice is necessary, that the system must be preserved, even as the value of what they will receive continues to shrink. This is not a deliberate fraud in the traditional sense. It is something more subtle, a political promise that depends on future populations having fewer choices than the present one. A system that survives by rolling obligations forward, quietly, year after year. The cost of longevity is not shared equally. It is deferred. After the 2008 crisis, central banks introduced policies few citizens had ever heard of before. Quantitative easing. Trillions of dollars were created to stabilize financial markets. Central banks purchased government bonds and financial assets on an unprecedented scale, injecting liquidity into the system. The justification was stability. The result was distortion. Asset prices surged. Stocks, real estate, and bonds climbed rapidly. Those who already owned assets saw their wealth expand. Those who did not were left behind. For households living on wages, the benefits were minimal. Income growth lagged behind rising costs, while housing and investment opportunities moved further out of reach. The gap between asset owners and wage earners widened, not accidentally, but mechanically. New money does not enter the economy evenly. It flows first to financial markets. This is how inequality is produced without passing a single law explicitly favoring the wealthy. The system remains legal, technical, and largely invisible to those outside of it. People are told the economy is recovering, but recovery depends on where you stand. For many, life becomes more expensive, while ownership becomes more distant. Inequality is not imposed by force. It is engineered through policy and maintained through complexity. In theory, regulations exist to protect the public. Financial laws are meant to prevent abuse. Safety standards are meant to reduce harm. Consumer protections are meant to ensure fairness. On paper, the system looks balanced. In reality, power does not disappear, it reorganizes. Large corporations and financial institutions invest enormous resources into influencing the very agencies designed to regulate them. Lobbying, revolving door employment, and technical complexity slowly reshape the rules from the inside. This process is known as regulatory capture. The laws still exist. Oversight still appears intact, but enforcement shifts subtly in favor of those with the resources to navigate and shape the system. Complex regulations create barriers to entry. Small competitors struggle to comply. Large firms absorb the cost easily and consolidate their advantage. What looks like protection becomes insulation. The public sees rules. Insiders see leverage. In any unequal system, the real winners are not those who play the game best, but those who control how the game is played. When laws are written in dense technical language, oversight becomes inaccessible to ordinary citizens, and accountability fades. The system does not need to be corrupt to produce corruption. It only needs to be complex enough. Few things justify spending faster than war. In times of conflict, governments frame borrowing as a patriotic necessity. Citizens are encouraged to support the effort by purchasing war bonds, accepting higher taxes, or tolerating inflation. The cause is presented as temporary. The cost is not. Throughout the 20th century, major wars were financed primarily through debt. World War I and World War II saw massive bond issuance across Europe and the United States. The public was told this was an investment in national survival. And in one sense, it was. But war finance also created guaranteed profits for contractors, banks, and bondholders. These returns were secured by future tax revenue long after the fighting ended. In the modern era, the pattern remains unchanged. Trillions were spent on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, largely funded through borrowing. Defense contractors expanded. Financial institutions earned fees. Bondholders received interest. The bill, however, was deferred. Decades later, taxpayers continue to service that debt through inflation, taxes, and reduced public spending. War is treated as an emergency. Debt is treated as permanent. Short-term urgency becomes long-term obligation. And once again, benefits are concentrated while costs are distributed across generations who never consented to the original decision. At its core, the problem is not whether governments should intervene in the economy. Intervention is unavoidable in any complex society. The real question is far simpler and far more uncomfortable. Who benefits first and who pays last? Across history, the pattern is consistent. When control over money, credit, and debt is concentrated in the hands of a small group, the risks are pushed outward while the rewards are pulled inward. Losses are delayed, costs are diffused, responsibility becomes abstract. Those closest to the source of money creation and policy design are insulated. Those furthest away absorb the consequences through higher living costs, reduced security, and declining purchasing power. This is not always the result of malicious intent. Often it emerges naturally from systems designed to protect themselves. Institutions prioritize survival. Financial structures favor stability over fairness. Political incentives reward short-term calm over long-term balance. Over time, this creates a system where intervention becomes permanent, debt becomes normal, and the public quietly adjusts expectations downward. The structure persists not because it is hidden, but because it is normalized. The most effective mechanisms of wealth transfer are not enforced through force. They are enforced through language, stimulus, reform, stability, growth. These words sound reassuring. They frame sacrifice as progress and loss as necessity. Behind them lies a simple reality. Wealth is steadily shifted from the many to the few, from labor to capital, from the public to concentrated power. The greatest advantage this system holds is not control over money, it is control over understanding. Financial illiteracy is not an accident. It is a structural advantage. When people do not understand how inflation works, how debt is serviced, or how policy incentives operate, they accept outcomes they would otherwise question. They confuse consequences with fate. History shows that economic systems do not repeat themselves perfectly, but they do repeat their logic. Rome debased its currency. Monarchs imposed forced loans. Modern states issue debt and expand money supply. Different tools, same outcome. Understanding economic history is not about prediction. It is about recognition. When you recognize the pattern, manipulation becomes harder. When you understand the rules, blind trust disappears. Knowledge does not guarantee escape, but ignorance guarantees vulnerability. And in a system that quietly transfers value over time, awareness is not rebellion. It is self-defense.